All right, so how's everybody doing? Hopefully, you are in the middle of a great week. And I wanted to talk about something that I've sort of noticed, and probably perhaps other people have spoken about this as well. It's basically, um, I'm guilty of this. So it's why do modern guitar players, specifically a lot of jazz players, they sound eerily alike? This could be the same thing for a couple of the shred guys as well. But what I've noticed is that if somebody sends me a video of somebody who is a whiz kid and they're playing jazz, they sound very, very similar. So I kind of look back at how I started playing guitar, and my heroes. So if I said Wes Montgomery, Joe Pass, Grant Green, Pat Martino, George Benson, I would think of these guys. They all sound very different, and it's not just the sound on their guitar or their tone. They were just very, very different, and they had a very, very identifiable style of playing and sound that they generated. And yes, everybody says that the sound is in their fingers, but I think there's a couple of different reasons why. You had Wes, he played with his thumb. You had Joe Pass, who was a master. He played both pick and his thumb. Pat Martino's probably, if not my favorite guitarist, one of them. He was, to me, the original shredder. The eighth notes and the syncopation of it was just awesome. Benson took everything from Charlie Christian and everybody who preceded him, and he took it to the next level. I call those guys the stalwarts, the real heritage, and they sounded very, very, very different. Why was that the case? And even the modern guitars, I would call these guys early modern. Schofield sounds very different than Frizzell and Metheny. Okay, they all sound different. But yet, nowadays, when I see somebody playing, and I'm not going to start naming names or anything like that, they sound very, very, very much alike. And I think there are three primary reasons why that's the case. The first one, I think, has to do with equipment and effects. And this is more about the tone, even though we keep saying that tone comes from our hands. And I think this was kind of started, there's other people, but I call it the Metheny-esque of the sound in and of itself. So Metheny used a lot of delays, and there was like a lot of sustain and reverb and things of that nature. And all of a sudden, you see a lot of younger, more contemporary guitar players, using a lot of effects, delays, slight choruses, and these fractal, whatever you call it, and things of that nature. And that sound is so heavy and so prevalent that it makes them, even if they're stylistically very different, it makes the sound so overpoweringly similar that to me they're sounding the same because of some of these pedals and effects that they're using. Okay, the next two reason why I think they sound alike has to do with education and training and how we're learning right now. The first one, or I should say the second one, which would be visual training. We used to learn from our ears, and we used to learn, I think, a little bit more from other musicians than from other guitar players. So in other words, when Joe Pass and Grant Green and Wes Montgomery were learning, they weren't watching videos of Guthrie Govan or whoever was the latest person and then trying to actually see what they were doing. They were listening to bands play, or they were on the bandstand, and they were listening to horn players play with them, pianists play with them, and other instrumentalists. And so they were pulling from that. Not that they weren't affected by other guitar players, but it was a much, much more collaborative way of learning that wasn't so visually based. It was auditory based. Even growing up myself, I didn't have access to YouTube. Most of the stuff I did was I learned through my ears, trying to figure things out. And if you're learning through that as opposed to visual way, you start playing things very differently. Like, I'll use an example of Stone songs. I never knew what open tunings were. So I played a slew of Stone songs that I figured out by ear. And it was one time, years later, after I'd played a lot of Stone songs, I'm sitting there watching, and I'm like, Keith Richards is playing something. I was like, he's playing it wrong. Well, he's Keith Richards. He's playing it right. I learned it by ear, didn't know how to do an open tuning, and figured out the song, and it sounded fine to me. It sounded great. So learning that way too means that I played different, and it was just very different than what I was getting out of it from Keith. So again, you got the equipment and the effects, the visual training more so than auditory, and also too, you have people just copying things. They're not thinking about how to approach it from themselves. So that to me are two of the main reasons. The third one is again education, conservatory type training. When Joe Pass and Grant Green and George Benson and all these people were learning, there wasn't as many schools. There wasn't Berkeley around to the same extent. New School of Social Research and all these things, Miami, or if they were around, they weren't as developed. So what happened is that as all of these kids are being trained to play jazz music, they're all learning exactly the same way to play. Let's just put it that way. So there's a heavy emphasis on intellectualization of the whole jazz pedagogy in terms of playing over chords, via modes, via scales, substitutions. If you all learn the exact same way, you're going to start sounding exactly the same. What I found happen is, like, when I hear of somebody say that went to Berkeley or another school and they sound, I'll take a perfect example, like Lionel Luecki, right? He sounds very, very different. And then anybody that I've heard, most of these people either leave those institutions or they came from someplace else that they're pulling from that. So it's not totally purely affected by the conservatory training. So Lionel is pulling in his heritage and things of that nature. And if you notice, even some of the guys who are famous, that they didn't really stay in the conservatory. They got what they needed after a year of Berkeley or North Texas State, and then they left and they went out on the road. And you can say, well, they didn't have enough money to finish it or like that. And I'm not trying to say, well, maybe I am saying that the conservatory stifles creativity to a certain extent. It procreates knowledge, let's just put it that way. But at the same time, the individuality and you finding your voice, it's very, very difficult if I'm going in there and some teacher is going to tell me all of the different chords and scales and things to play. If I am good enough and strong enough to be able to pull what I need to pull in, but keep my individualism and my style, then it's going to work. So there you have it. For me, I think those are the three reasons why a lot of modern guitarists, and I'm only talking guitar players, somebody could say this is the same for other musicians, and I'm specifically talking about jazz guitars, jazz guitarists. The three reasons for me, again, are equipment and effects being used. There's conservatory training and the way we're learning, which is more visual as opposed to auditory learning. So having said that, it's still incumbent upon you to find your own soul and your own voice in the music that you play in. And yeah, eventually you will. But as usual, always practice, practice, and practice. Practice what you want to practice, but also practice some of the basics and the fundamentals, and you will get better and you will find your own voice. Again, thank you for watching.